Dawn broke over Ashford Manor with the tentative grace of autumn in 1847, the kind of morning that seemed designed by Providence itself for new beginnings, when mist clung to the valley like a silk veil, and the first light turned the falling leaves to coins of copper and gold. The house had been awake since before sunrise, alive with the peculiar energy that attends a wedding day, servants rushing through corridors with armfuls of white roses, the cook barking orders in the kitchen where the wedding breakfast was taking shape, chambermaids whispering excitedly as they performed their duties with unusual care. In the east bedroom, Miss Eleanor Hartley sat motionless before her mirror, already dressed in her wedding gown, a creation of ivory silk and Brussels lace that had taken 6 seamstresses 3 months to complete, and she looked, by all accounts, like a bride from a storybook, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure threaded with pearls, her face pale but composed, her hands folded carefully in her lap to avoid crushing the delicate fabric. She was 23 years old, of respectable family but modest fortune, and today she was to marry Lord Philip Hastings, a match that had pleased her parents enormously and had seemed, to Eleanor herself, a pathway to the life she had been raised to expect: comfort, security, children, a place in society. The knock at her door came at 6:30, and she called for entry without turning from her reflection, assuming it was her mother come to fuss over some final detail, but it was instead the young footman Thomas, his face peculiarly stricken, carrying a sealed letter on a silver tray. "For you, miss," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and something in his expression made Eleanor's stomach tighten with an unnamed dread even before she broke the wax seal bearing Philip's family crest. The words swam before her eyes at first, refusing to coalesce into meaning, but then they sharpened into a clarity that was worse than any confusion. "Asterisk, my dear Eleanor, I find I cannot in good conscience proceed with our wedding today. The reasons are complex and reflect poorly on my own character rather than any deficiency in yours. I have taken the early coach to London and thence to Dover. Please convey my apologies to your family. I am conscious that this is an act of profound cowardice, and I can offer no excuse that would be adequate. I release you from all obligations. Yours, Philip. Asterisk." The letter slipped from her fingers to the floor, a small rectangle of cream paper that held within its brief sentences the complete destruction of her future, and Eleanor sat frozen, her reflection in the mirror showing a bride who no longer had a groom, a woman in a wedding dress that had suddenly become a costume for a performance that would not take place. The sounds of the house continued around her, the servants still bustling, still preparing, still believing that in 2 hours Miss Eleanor Hartley would walk down the aisle of St. Catherine's Church to become Lady Hastings, and she could not move, could not speak, could not reconcile the magnitude of what had just occurred with the cheerful innocence of the morning. The wedding gown, which had felt that morning like a promise, now felt like a shroud, the weight of the silk suddenly oppressive against her skin, and she thought with a strange detachment that this was what death must feel like, this sense of the world continuing while one's own existence had fundamentally ended. Her mother's scream, when she entered the room moments later and saw her daughter's face, saw the letter on the floor, seemed to come from very far away, and Eleanor watched as though from a great distance as Mrs. Hartley snatched up the paper, read it with increasing horror, and then turned to her daughter with an expression that contained equal parts shock, fury, and something that looked terribly like accusation, as though Eleanor herself might somehow be responsible for this catastrophe that had befallen them all. Mrs. Hartley's panic, once she had absorbed the full meaning of Philip's letter, manifested not as maternal comfort, but as a kind of frantic calculation, her mind racing through the implications, even as Eleanor sat motionless in her wedding gown, and her first words were not, "Are you well?" or "How can I help?" but rather, "The guests, oh God, the guests are already on their way to the church. Some will have arrived already. What are we to tell them?" Eleanor heard her mother's voice as though through water, the words distorted and strange, and she found herself thinking with peculiar clarity that this, then, was the true horror of her situation, not the private heartbreak of rejection, which she might have borne in solitude, but the public spectacle of her humiliation, the fact that at this very moment carriages were rolling toward St. Catherine's Church, carrying 200 members of society who expected to witness her triumph and would instead witness her degradation, Her father arrived moments later, summoned by her mother's cry, and Eleanor watched his face transform as he read the letter, watched the color drain from his complexion, as he understood not merely that his daughter had been jilted, but that his own financial situation, which had been precarious and was to have been stabilized by this advantageous match, was now in jeopardy. "This is catastrophe," he said, and Eleanor noted with a strange detachment that he did not look at her as he spoke, but rather at the letter, at the walls, at anything but his daughter's face. "We are ruined. The scandal alone will be insurmountable, but beyond that, the debts I incurred in expectation of this alliance, the promises I made." His voice trailed off, and Eleanor understood then with perfect clarity that she was not, in this moment, a beloved daughter to be comforted, but rather a failed investment, an asset that had inexplicably lost all value. Her mother was speaking rapidly now, presenting options with desperate energy. They could send word to the church that Eleanor had taken ill, that the wedding must be postponed, though, of course, everyone would eventually learn the truth, and the postponement would only delay the inevitable scandal. Or they could simply not appear at all, could remain here at Ashford Manor and face the consequences of leaving 200 guests waiting in vain. Or, and here, her mother's voice took on a peculiar quality that Eleanor recognized as barely suppressed hysteria. Eleanor could go to the church and face them all, could stand before the congregation and explain with whatever dignity she could muster that there would be no wedding, that Lord Hastings had withdrawn his suit. The numbness that had gripped Eleanor since reading Philip's letter began to crack, giving way to something more painful, a deep, burning humiliation that suffused her entire body, a shame so profound it was almost physical. She thought of her limited options as an unmarried woman of 23 with a modest dowry, and now a scandal attached to her name. She would likely never receive another offer of marriage, would become that pitiable creature, a spinster living on the charity of relatives, forever marked as the woman who had been rejected at the altar. Yet even as these bleak realities pressed upon her, something else stirred within Eleanor, a stubborn pride perhaps, or simply a refusal to add cowardice to her list of humiliations. "I will go to the church," she heard herself say, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, distant and formal. "I will face them. I will not hide from what has been done to me." Her parents stared at her as though she had suggested something utterly mad, but Eleanor rose from her seat before the mirror, the wedding gown rustling around her, and moved toward the door with a determination that surprised even herself, driven by the conviction that if she was to be destroyed by this day, she would at least meet her destruction standing upright. The carriage ride to St. Catherine's Church passed in a blur of autumn countryside, the beauty of the morning now seeming like a mockery, and Eleanor found herself thinking of all the foolish dreams she had entertained about her future with Philip, the children she had imagined, the home she had pictured, the life that had evaporated in the space of a single letter. And she understood with bitter clarity that she had never truly loved him. She had loved the idea of him, the security he represented, the escape from the vulnerability of her unmarried state, and perhaps that made this abandonment not less painful, but differently painful, tinged with the recognition of her own self-deception. As the carriage pulled up before the church, Eleanor could see through the window that the congregation had indeed assembled, that the building was full of witnesses to her shame, and she took a long, steadying breath, preparing herself to walk into that space and face the ruin of everything she had been taught to value, every hope she had been raised to cherish, and she stepped down from the carriage with her head held high, moving toward the church doors, like a condemned woman walking toward her execution, with the only dignity left to her, the dignity of facing her fate without flinching. Eleanor walked down the aisle of St. Catherine's Church alone, her father having refused at the last moment to accompany her, unable to bear the public nature of their humiliation, and so she moved through that sacred space unescorted, the ivory silk of her gown whispering against the stone floor, her steps measured and deliberate despite the trembling in her limbs, and she was aware of every eye upon her, aware of the confused murmuring that rippled through the assembled guests as they noticed the absence of a groom at the altar, the empty space where Lord Philip Hastings should have been standing, seeming to expand with each step she took, becoming a void that threatened to swallow her entirely. The vicar, Reverend Thornbury, stood at the front of the church with an expression of profound discomfort, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the empty space beside him. clearly uncertain of what protocol demanded in such an unprecedented situation, and Eleanor could see the moment when comprehension dawned on the faces in the pews, could watch the realization spread through the congregation like ripples across a pond. Something was terribly, irredeemably wrong. This was not merely a delayed groom but an absent one, and the bride was walking alone toward an altar where no marriage would take place. She reached the front of the church and turned to face the sea of faces, all those members of society who had come expecting to witness her triumph and would instead witness her degradation, and she drew a breath that seemed to come from the very depths of her being, preparing to speak the words that would confirm their suspicions and cement her ruin, preparing to explain with whatever dignity she could summon that Lord Hastings had withdrawn his suit, that there would be no wedding, that they had all assembled to witness not a union, but a public abandonment. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she had expected. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must inform you that—" But she got no further, for at that moment the great doors of the church, which had been closed after the last guests arrived, swung open with a sound like thunder, and every head turned to see a figure silhouetted against the autumn morning light. A tall man striding into the church with such commanding presence that the murmuring ceased instantly, replaced by a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the rustling of his coat as he moved. He was perhaps 32 years of age, dressed in formal attire of obvious quality, with dark hair and features that were striking rather than handsome, marked by a certain severity that suggested a man accustomed to authority, and Eleanor had never seen him before in her life. Yet he walked down that aisle with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there, his eyes fixed not on the congregation but on her, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the vaulted space with perfect clarity, cutting through the shocked silence like a blade through silk. "I believe there has been a mistake. This is my wedding." The words hung in the air, impossible and incomprehensible, and Eleanor felt the church tilt around her as though the very foundations of reality had shifted. For this stranger, this unknown man, had just claimed her wedding as his own, had inserted himself into the narrative of her humiliation with an audacity that defied all reason, and she stood frozen at the altar, her prepared speech forgotten, her mind struggling to process what was happening, even as the stranger, whoever he was, continued his purposeful approach, moving toward her with the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, while she knew nothing at all except that her morning of devastation had just taken a turn into territory she could never have anticipated, territory that might be salvation or might be a different species of disaster entirely. The confusion that rippled through St. Catherine's Church was almost palpable, a collective incomprehension that manifested in gasps and whispers and the rustling of fabric. As 200 guests shifted in their pews to better observe this extraordinary development, and Sebastian, for Eleanor, would later learn that this was Sebastian Ashworth, Duke of Rothermere, a man whose name she had heard in passing but whose face she had never before seen, continued his approach to the altar with the kind of absolute authority that made questioning him seem somehow impossible, as though the sheer force of his will could reshape reality itself, and Eleanor stood frozen in her ivory gown, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening, even as some instinct told her that this stranger, whoever he was, had just offered her something she could not yet name but desperately needed. He reached the altar and positioned himself beside her, close enough that she could see the fine weave of his coat, could detect the scent of bergamot and something else, something like cedar or autumn leaves, and then he turned to her with those striking dark eyes and spoke in a voice pitched for her ears alone, a voice that cut through the chaos in her mind with surprising clarity. "Trust me, I am offering you a choice." The words were simple, but Eleanor heard in them a complexity of meaning that she could not fully pass in that moment. Choice, when she had thought all choices stripped from her, when she had walked into this church believing herself utterly without options, and before she could respond, before she could even formulate the questions that crowded her throat, Sebastian was speaking again, still quietly, his words coming quickly as though he understood they had only seconds before the vicar or someone in the congregation demanded explanation. "I know what Hastings has done. I know he has abandoned you. I can offer you an alternative to ruin, but you must decide now: scandal and social destruction, or marriage to a stranger who swears he will treat you with honor." The impossible nature of the offer, its audacity, its presumption, Its utter incomprehensibility warred in Eleanor's mind with the cold reality of her situation, and she found herself thinking with peculiar clarity that she had already decided once today to face her fate with dignity. And perhaps this was simply another form of that same decision, another instance of choosing action over paralysis, agency over victimhood. Reverend Thornbury had found his voice and was demanding explanation, his confusion transmuting into indignation at this disruption to the sacred proceedings. And Sebastian turned from Eleanor to address both the vicar and the assembled congregation with the kind of commanding presence that came, Eleanor supposed, from a lifetime of being a duke, from never having to question whether one would be obeyed. "I apologize for the confusion, Reverend Thornbury, ladies and gentlemen. There has been a misunderstanding about the arrangements. The prior understanding between the Hartley family and my own predates Lord Hastings's suit, a matter of some delicacy that discretion prevented from becoming public knowledge until circumstances made revelation necessary." It was a lie, transparent to Eleanor but delivered with such confidence, such certainty, and backed by the considerable weight of his title and status, that she could see it taking root in the minds of the guests and could watch them beginning to construct narratives that would make this acceptable, plausible, merely unusual, rather than insane. Sebastian's hand moved to hers, his fingers warm against her cold skin, and he looked at her with an expression that asked a question more profound than words, and Eleanor, standing at the crossroads of devastation and mystery, made her choice, whispered her agreement, in a voice that trembled but did not break, and bound herself to salvation, or perhaps simply to a different species of uncertainty, to this stranger who had walked into her ruin and claimed it as his own. The ceremony proceeded with a surreal quality that made Eleanor feel as though she had stepped outside her own body and was watching events unfold from some distant vantage point, observing this strange wedding between a woman who looked like her and a man she had never before seen, and Reverend Thornbury, recovering from his bewilderment, and perhaps recognizing that to question a duke too aggressively would be imprudent, began the service with a voice that trembled only slightly, reading the familiar words that took on entirely unfamiliar meaning when spoken over two people who were strangers to one another, who had never courted or laughed together or shared the smallest intimacy that should precede such binding vows. Eleanor found herself noticing peculiar details about Sebastian as they stood side by side at the altar, the steadiness of his hands, which did not shake at all despite the audacity of what he was doing, and the clean line of his profile when she glanced sideways at him, the way he stood with absolute stillness, as though he had complete confidence in every choice he had made, and the scent of him that she had noticed earlier, that combination of bergamot and cedar that was surprisingly pleasant, surprisingly calming in the midst of chaos, and she thought distantly that these were strange things to notice about a man to whom she was binding her entire future, her body, her legal existence. Strange that she should be aware of the weave of his coat rather than the enormity of what she was doing. The vows, when they came to them, fell from her lips like words in a foreign language, words whose meaning she understood intellectually but could not quite feel emotionally. And when Sebastian spoke his own vows, his voice was steady and clear, carrying through the church with a conviction that seemed remarkable, given that he was promising to honor and cherish a woman whose Christian name he had learned only minutes before, and Eleanor wondered what manner of man would do this, would walk into a church and claim a stranger's abandoned wedding as his own, would speak vows of lifelong commitment with such apparent sincerity. The ring, when he produced it, was clearly his own family signet, far too large for her finger, and as he slid it onto her hand, holding it in place with his thumb so it would not fall off, their eyes met for a moment, and Eleanor saw something in his expression that she could not quite name determination, certainly, but also something gentler, something that looked almost like understanding or perhaps compassion, and then Reverend Thornbury was pronouncing them man and wife, and the words that should have brought joy brought instead a kind of numb disbelief, and the Reverend's instruction came, that moment dreaded and awaited, "You may kiss the bride." Sebastian's hands came to her shoulders with surprising gentleness, and his touch, careful as though she were something fragile that might shatter, and he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that lasted only seconds, but that seared itself into her awareness. Their first touch, the moment that sealed this incomprehensible union, and it was softer than she had expected, almost tentative, as though he too felt the strangeness of kissing a stranger, of performing intimacy without foundation, and then he was stepping back, offering his arm, and she took it because there was nothing else to do, and they turned to face the congregation together, and Eleanor could hear the whispers beginning even as they stood there, could see the speculation in every face, the gossip already forming that would follow them both for years, and she was aware with peculiar clarity that she had just bound herself irrevocably to an unknown man, that she was no longer Miss Eleanor Hartley, but rather the Duchess of Rothermere, that she was walking back down the aisle of St. Catherine's Church as a married woman, though to what sort of marriage she could not begin to imagine. And when they emerged into the autumn sunlight, there was a carriage waiting his carriage, not her family's, and she understood that her old life had ended entirely, that whatever came next would be utterly unlike anything she had known before. The carriage pulled away from St. Catherine's Church with a lurch that seemed to mirror the vertiginous sensation in Eleanor's chest, and she found herself sitting across from her new husband, a phrase that felt absurd, even as her mind formed it, in a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down upon them both as the wheels rolled over the cobblestones and carried them away from everything Eleanor had ever known. And she stared at her hands in her lap, at the oversized signet ring that kept sliding around her finger, and wondered with a kind of detached hysteria what manner of dream or nightmare she had entered, what strange realm existed where one could begin the day, preparing to marry one man and end it bound legally and spiritually to another she had never before met. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions, hers about his motivations and expectations, his perhaps about whether she would dissolve into hysterics or demand to be returned to her family, and Eleanor could feel Sebastian's presence across from her with an awareness that seemed heightened by the enclosed space, the intimacy of the carriage that trapped them together, and she thought that she should speak, should ask the thousand questions that crowded her mind, but her throat felt closed, and her thoughts scattered like leaves in wind, incapable of forming coherent speech. Finally, after what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes, Sebastian spoke, his voice cutting through the silence with surprising gentleness. "I realize you must have questions, and you deserve answers." Eleanor lifted her eyes to his face and found him watching her with an expression that seemed genuinely concerned, and he continued, explaining that he had heard of Philip Hastings's intentions through mutual acquaintances in London. That word had reached him only yesterday, of Philip's plan to abandon the wedding, and Eleanor felt a flash of something like anger. Why had no one thought to warn her, to give her more than hours to prepare? But Sebastian was continuing, revealing that he had known Philip at university, that he was familiar with his character, his weaknesses, his pattern of creating disasters and fleeing them. "Hastings has gambling debts," Sebastian said, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind, substantial ones, to men who do not accept excuses or delays in payment, and he has fled to the continent to escape both his creditors and the marriage that he had come to view as another trap, another obligation he lacked the courage to fulfill. The information should have devastated Eleanor, this confirmation that Philip's abandonment was rooted not in any failing of hers, but in his own moral weakness, but instead, she felt only a strange numbness, as though the day had already contained so much shock that she had no capacity left for additional pain. And she found herself asking the question that mattered most. Why would you do this? Why would you rescue a stranger? Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away but somehow could not. And then he said simply, "Because I could not stand by and watch you destroyed by another man's cowardice, and because I hoped you might prefer an uncertain future with a stranger who swears to treat you honorably to certain ruin in the society that would have blamed you for Hastings's failures." It was not, Eleanor noticed, truly an answer to her question. It explained his actions, but not his motivations, the deeper reason why he would take such an extraordinary step. But before she could press further, she found herself asking the question that frightened her most. "What do you expect from this arrangement?" Sebastian's expression softened slightly, and he leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, closing some of the distance between them. "Time, patience, the chance to know one another. I expect nothing that you are not willing to give, Eleanor. I may call you Eleanor?" She nodded mutely, and he continued, I do not expect you to feel anything for me, certainly not yet, perhaps not ever, but I hope we might at least build something honest between us, whatever form that takes. The landscape outside the carriage windows had changed from the familiar lanes around her family's estate to wilder country, hills rising in the distance as they traveled north toward lands Eleanor had never seen, and she watched the autumn colors blur past gold and russet and deep green, and felt exhaustion creeping over her like a tide, the accumulated strain of the day finally catching up with her body, even as her mind continued to race, and despite her best efforts to remain alert, to continue asking questions and seeking answers, her eyes grew heavy and her head nodded forward, and the last thing she was aware of before sleep claimed her was Sebastian's voice, very quiet, instructing the driver to slow their pace so as not to jostle her, and the peculiar comfort of knowing that even unconscious, she was somehow safe. Eleanor woke to the sensation of the carriage slowing, the change in rhythm pulling her from sleep that had been deeper than she expected, and she blinked against the dimming afternoon light to find Sebastian still sitting across from her, his expression unreadable as he gazed out the window, and when he noticed her stirring, he said quietly, "We've arrived at Rothermere," and Eleanor turned to look out her own window and felt her breath catch at the sight of the estate that was now somehow her home. Rothermere Hall rose before them like something from a painting, all grey stone and mullioned windows, magnificent in its architecture yet somehow melancholy in its grandeur, as though the house itself carried a weight of sadness, and the grounds that surrounded it were extensive, sweeping lawns and distant woods and gardens that she could see even from this distance had a wild, untended quality, and Eleanor thought that it was beautiful but lonely. This place, beautiful but somehow bereft of joy, and she wondered what sort of life awaited her within those ancient walls. The carriage came to a stop before the main entrance, and Sebastian descended first, then turned to offer his hand to help her down, and Eleanor took it, feeling the strength in his grip as she stepped onto the gravel drive, and immediately the great doors opened, and staff began to emerge, and Eleanor could see the curiosity and surprise poorly concealed on their faces, for clearly they had not expected their master to return with a bride, certainly not so suddenly, certainly not without warning. At the head of the assembled servants stood a woman of perhaps 50 years, her bearing dignified and her expression kind despite the obvious bewilderment in her eyes, and Sebastian said, "Mrs. Brennan, may I present the Duchess of Rothermere? Eleanor, this is Mrs. Brennan, who has kept Rothermere Hall running efficiently since before I was born." Mrs. Brennan dropped into a curtsy, and when she rose, Eleanor saw warmth in her face alongside the questions that clearly crowded her mind, and the housekeeper said, "Your Grace, welcome to Rothermere. We are honored to receive you," and Eleanor managed to murmur her thanks, though she felt the unreality of the moment that she should be addressed as "Your Grace," that she should be standing here as mistress of this vast estate, and that any of this should be happening at all. Sebastian spoke to the assembled staff with easy authority, instructing them that the Duchess was to be given every comfort, that her word was to be respected as his own, that she had travelled far and would require time to settle. And then Mrs. Brennan was guiding Eleanor into the house, through halls that seemed to echo with emptiness despite their grandeur, up a sweeping staircase to the first floor, and finally to a suite of rooms that Mrs. Brennan announced had been the Duchess's chambers. The rooms were beautiful, a spacious bedchamber with windows overlooking the gardens, a smaller sitting room, a dressing room, but there was something about them that spoke of long disuse, a quality in the air that suggested these spaces had not housed a living presence in many years, and Eleanor noticed that while everything was clean, there was a kind of stillness here, as though the rooms themselves had been holding their breath, waiting. Mrs. Brennan explained that Agnes, one of the younger maids, would serve as her lady's maid until such time as Eleanor wished to hire someone more experienced, and almost immediately a girl of perhaps 18 appeared, bright-eyed and clearly excited by the sudden drama that had entered the household, and Eleanor thanked Mrs. Brennan, who curtsied and withdrew, leaving Eleanor with Agnes, who chattered nervously about how honoured she was to serve the new Duchess, how unexpected this all was, how romantic, and Eleanor stood in the centre of the Duchess's bedchamber, still wearing the wedding gown that had been meant for a different marriage entirely, and felt the full weight of the day finally crashing down upon her, the morning's devastation, the humiliation at the altar, the incomprehensible rescue, the vows to a stranger, the journey to this unknown place. And suddenly she could not bear Agnes's cheerful talking, could not bear anything, and she said with as much gentleness as she could manage that she wished to be alone, and Agnes, perhaps sensing something in her tone, curtsied quickly and disappeared, and Eleanor was finally by herself, and the tears that she had held back through all the long, impossible hours finally came, and she sank onto the edge of the great bed and wept into her hands, for everything she had lost and everything she had gained, and the terrifying uncertainty of everything that lay ahead. Eleanor remained in her chambers until Agnes returned perhaps an hour later, with a tentative knock and the information that His Grace requested the honor of the Duchess's presence at dinner, and the phrasing so formal, so careful, struck Eleanor as almost absurd given that they were married, that he had every right to demand her presence rather than request it, and yet she found herself grateful for his consideration, even as she dreaded the prospect of sitting across from this stranger and attempting conversation after the overwhelming events of the day. Agnes helped her out of the wedding gown, unlacing the dozens of tiny buttons with gentle efficiency, and produced a dinner dress that Mrs. Brennan had found among the late Duchess's clothing, stored away in trunks for decades, and though the style was somewhat outdated, it fit Eleanor well enough once Agnes made a few quick adjustments, and Eleanor caught sight of herself in the looking-glass and saw a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes red from weeping, but her chin lifted with a determination she did not entirely feel, and she thought that she must find some way to navigate this impossible situation, must discover what manner of life awaited her in this vast and melancholy house. The dining room, when Agnes led her to it, proved to be exactly as overwhelming as Eleanor had feared, a cavernous space with a table that could easily seat 30, the walls hung with portraits of long-dead Ashworths who gazed down with stern expressions, and the whole chamber seemed designed to make two people feel absurdly small and isolated, and Eleanor saw Sebastian already standing near the head of the table, and he had changed from his wedding attire into evening clothes, and something in his bearing seemed less assured than it had been at the church, as though he too felt the strangeness of their situation now that the dramatic rescue was complete and they were left to face the reality of what they had done. He pulled out a chair for her, not at the far end of the table but near enough that conversation would be possible without shouting, and Eleanor sat with as much grace as she could summon, and a footman appeared to serve the first course, and silence stretched between them, awkward and heavy, until Sebastian finally said, "I hope the Duchess's chambers are comfortable. If there is anything you require, you need only ask Mrs. Brennan, or tell me directly." Eleanor assured him the rooms were beautiful, though she did not mention how they had felt haunted by absence, and Sebastian nodded and attempted another topic, asking about her interests, whether she enjoyed reading or music or riding, and Eleanor answered carefully, still uncertain of his motivations, still guarded despite his kindness, and she could feel herself performing a role, the Duchess, the grateful rescued bride, rather than speaking as herself, whoever that self might be in this transformed existence. It was Sebastian who finally broke through the careful formality by setting down his fork and saying quietly, "You must think me mad or presumptuously arrogant to have done what I did today." And Eleanor met his eyes and saw something vulnerable there, something that did not match the commanding figure who had strode into street Catherine's with such authority, and he continued, "My mother died when I was 12 years old. My father followed her 2 years ago. This house has been lonely for longer than I care to admit, and I—" But he stopped himself, as though having revealed too much already, and Eleanor found herself saying, before she could reconsider, "I understand loneliness, Your Grace, perhaps better now than ever before." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, a softening, a recognition, and he said, "Sebastian, please, we are married, after all, however strangely that came to pass." The use of his Christian name felt intimate and frightening, another step into this new reality, but Eleanor nodded, and Sebastian continued, promising that she could write to her family as often as she wished, that he would not isolate her from those she loved. And his unexpected kindness in acknowledging the trauma of the day, in recognizing that she had lost much even as she had gained a title and wealth, made Eleanor feel something crack in her chest, some portion of her defensive walls crumbling, and when the meal finally ended, and Sebastian asked if she required anything else, Eleanor found herself saying only that she needed rest. exhaustion beyond measure finally claiming her, and he escorted her back to the Duchess's chambers himself and bid her good night with a bow that seemed almost sorrowful. And Eleanor closed the door between them and leaned against it and wondered what strange country she had entered and whether she would ever find her way to understanding it. The weeks that followed Eleanor's arrival at Rothermere Hall passed in a strange suspension between her old life and whatever her new existence would become, days blurring into one another with a quality that felt both dreamlike and unnervingly real. And she found herself establishing routines as a way to anchor herself in this unfamiliar world, waking each morning in the Duchess's chambers that still felt like borrowed spaces, taking breakfast in the small morning room rather than the cavernous dining hall, and then beginning her exploration of the estate that was now somehow her home. The library became her refuge, as libraries had always been. A vast room on the second floor with floor-to-ceiling shelves and windows that overlooked the untamed gardens, and Eleanor spent hours there, reading or simply sitting in the window seat, watching the autumn deepen across the grounds, the leaves turning from gold to russet to brown, and it was a room where she felt she could breathe, could exist without the weight of her new title pressing down upon her. Sebastian maintained a respectful distance that Eleanor recognized as considerate, even as it reinforced the strangeness between them. They still occupied separate chambers. He made no demands upon her. Their interactions consisted primarily of passing each other in hallways with polite nods, and the occasional dinner together where conversation remained carefully neutral, in discussing the weather or the estate or books, but never venturing into more dangerous territory. And Eleanor found herself observing him when she thought he would not notice, watching the way he spoke to the servants with genuine kindness rather than aristocratic dismissiveness, seeing him ride out alone across the estate in the mornings, his figure solitary against the grey autumn skies, and she sensed in him the same loneliness she carried, though his had clearly existed far longer than her own. Letters arrived from her mother with regularity, missives that expressed relief that Eleanor had not been ruined, confusion about how the Duke of Rothermere had come to be involved, anxious questions about whether Eleanor was well, whether she was being treated properly, and underlying all of it was a bewilderment that mirrored Eleanor's own, that her life should have transformed so completely in a single morning, that she should now be a duchess living in a grand estate rather than the wife of Lord Philip Hastings, living a more modest existence. The servants, Eleanor learned from Agnes's cheerful gossip, were intensely curious about the hasty marriage, and speculation had apparently reached the village as well, theories ranging from secret, long-standing romance to more scandalous suggestions. But Eleanor found she could not muster much concern for what others thought, for she was still trying to understand what had happened herself, still trying to comprehend why Sebastian had done what he did. It was on a rainy afternoon in late October, when Eleanor was curled in the library window seat with a volume of Wordsworth, that Sebastian entered unexpectedly, and she looked up to find him standing in the doorway, and for a moment neither spoke, and then he said quietly, "I hope I'm not intruding. I often come here in the afternoons," and Eleanor assured him he was not intruding, that this was his home after all, and something in her phrasing made him smile slightly, sadly, and he said, "It is your home too now, Eleanor," and moved to the shelves to select a book, and then, rather than leaving, he settled in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, and they remained there together in comfortable silence, both reading, the rain pattering against the windows, and when Eleanor came across a particular passage she loved, she read it aloud without thinking, and Sebastian looked up and completed the verse from memory, and their eyes met across the room, and Eleanor felt something shift, some small crack in the wall between them, and they began to talk, truly talk for the first time, about poetry and literature and the way certain words could capture what the heart felt. And the afternoon slipped away, and when Eleanor finally returned to her chambers for dinner preparations, she realized she had not thought of Philip or the ruined wedding or her old life once in all those hours, and the ice that had formed around her heart on that terrible morning had begun, just slightly, to thaw. Autumn deepened across the Rothermere estate, as October gave way to early November, the landscape transforming into shades of amber and rust and brown, and Eleanor found herself drawn increasingly to the gardens that sprawled behind the great house, wild and neglected, yet possessing a melancholic beauty in their decay, overgrown paths winding between beds, where roses had gone feral and hedges had lost their careful shapes. And it was during one of these solitary walks, the air crisp and smelling of dried leaves and approaching winter, that Sebastian appeared quite unexpectedly at her side, and she startled slightly, for she had not heard his approach, and he said quietly, "Forgive me, I did not mean to intrude upon your solitude. I saw you from the window, and thought perhaps you might like a guide to the grounds, though I confess they are not what they once were." Eleanor assured him she would welcome the company, and they began to walk together along the overgrown paths. And Sebastian pointed out various features: a fountain long dry, a pavilion where ivy had claimed the pillars, a rose garden that his mother had particularly loved, and Eleanor sensed a deep sadness in the way he spoke of these places, as though each neglected corner represented not merely horticultural failure, but some deeper abandonment. And finally she asked gently, "These gardens are beautiful even in their wildness, but they must have been magnificent once. Why have they not been maintained?" Sebastian stopped walking, his gaze fixed on a tangle of climbing roses that had overwhelmed their trellis, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old grief. "My mother designed every aspect of these gardens. She spent years planning them, planting them, tending them. After she died, my father could not bear to see them. He said it hurt too much, reminded him too acutely of what he had lost. And I was only a boy, and by the time I was old enough to understand, the neglect had become somehow fitting, as though maintaining them would betray the loss we felt, and the estate's heart had broken along with ours." Eleanor felt something shift in her understanding of the man beside her, seeing in his confession the roots of the loneliness she had sensed in him, and she said softly, "Grief can make us abandon what we love most, for fear that tending to it will somehow diminish the memory." And Sebastian looked at her with an expression of such recognition that Eleanor knew he understood she was speaking of more than gardens, and their conversation deepened, moving from his loss to hers, and Eleanor found herself speaking of the humiliation of Philip's abandonment, the way it had made her question her own worth, her own capacity to be loved, and Sebastian listened with an attention that felt like its own form of healing. And then Eleanor asked the question that had haunted her since that extraordinary morning at Street. "Catherine's, why did you truly marry me? A stranger facing ruin, what could have possessed you to bind yourself to such a situation?" Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice was raw with honesty. "Because I saw myself in you, standing there alone at a moment when everything should have been beginning. 7 years ago I was engaged to be married to a woman I believed loved me, but 3 weeks before our wedding she broke the engagement to accept an offer from a wealthier man, a marquess who could give her more than a mere duke's second son could offer, and I stood in an empty church meant for our ceremony, and felt the world judge me, insufficient, unworthy, and when I heard that Philip Hastings had abandoned you, for I knew Philip from university, knew his weakness and his selfishness, I thought of that moment, of how I had wished someone had offered me an alternative to the pitying stares and the whispered gossip, and I walked into that church and offered you what no one had offered me, a choice, a different path, a way forward that was not merely survival but perhaps, eventually, something more." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes at his confession, understanding suddenly that they were bound not merely by expedient circumstance, but by the parallel experiences of rejection and loneliness, both of them acquainted with the particular pain of being found wanting by those who had promised to love them, and she reached out without thinking and took his hand, and Sebastian's fingers closed around hers, and they stood together in the neglected garden as the autumn wind scattered leaves around them, two wounded souls beginning to recognize in each other the possibility of healing. The weeks that followed their conversation in the garden passed with a quality distinctly different from those that had come before, for something had shifted between Eleanor and Sebastian, some barrier had been breached, and as October gave way to November, they began to establish new routines that brought them into each other's company with increasing frequency, and Eleanor found herself waking earlier each morning in anticipation of the rides they had begun taking together across the estate, Sebastian appearing at her door with a gentle knock and an invitation that she never refused, and they would ride through the frost-touched landscape, their breath and their horse's breath creating clouds in the cold air, and he would point out boundaries and landmarks, explaining the workings of the estate with a patience that suggested he took genuine pleasure in sharing this knowledge with her. To Eleanor's surprise, Sebastian began teaching her the practical aspects of managing Rothermere, bringing her into the estate office and showing her the account books, explaining rents and expenditures and the delicate balance required to keep such a large property functioning. And Eleanor discovered in herself an unexpected aptitude for figures and organization, her questions insightful enough that Sebastian would pause and look at her with something like admiration, and she found deep satisfaction in understanding how the estate worked, in feeling herself becoming not merely an ornament in the great house, but a participant in its life. Small kindnesses began to accumulate between them like gentle snowfall, barely noticed in each individual moment, but transforming the landscape nonetheless. Sebastian bringing her tea in the library when he saw she had been reading for hours, the cup appearing at her elbow without fanfare, Eleanor mending a torn book jacket on a volume she knew to be his favorite, saying nothing about it but leaving it where he would find it. And these gestures, so much more eloquent than words, spoke of attention being paid, of care being taken, of two people beginning to weave their lives together strand by quiet strand. The staff noticed the change. Eleanor could see it in Mrs. Brennan's knowing smiles and Agnes's barely suppressed delight, the household settling into a contentment that suggested they approved of the warmth growing between their Duke and Duchess, and gossip from the village reported that opinion was shifting there as well, the initial scandal of the hasty marriage giving way to speculation of a different sort, romantic rather than suspicious. An evening ritual developed, unplanned but quickly becoming essential, where after dinner they would both gravitate to the library, and one or the other would read aloud, Shakespeare or Milton or their beloved Wordsworth, their voices filling the book-lined room while the fire crackled and the world outside grew dark and cold. And Eleanor found herself listening not only to the words but to the sound of Sebastian's voice, rich and textured, and she would glance up from her own book to find him looking at her with an expression she was learning to recognize, something tender, something searching, something that made her heart quicken. It was during one such evening when they both reached for the same volume on the shelf, their hands meeting in that shared space, that Eleanor felt it most acutely, the electricity that ran between them, unacknowledged but undeniable, and they both froze, neither pulling away, and for a long moment they simply stood there, hands touching, eyes meeting. And Eleanor saw in Sebastian's face the same awareness she felt, the same longing, the same fear of breaking whatever fragile thing was building between them, and when they finally did step back, murmuring apologies, they retreated to their separate chambers, more unsettled than they had been in weeks, and Eleanor lay awake in her vast bed, thinking of Sebastian in his chambers down the hall, and missing him even though he was only walls away, and wondering how much longer they could maintain this careful distance when everything in her was beginning to reach toward him, like those garden plants reaching toward light after a long darkness. November brought with it the kind of storms that swept in from the north with fierce determination, and on the third night of one such tempest, Eleanor was startled awake in her vast chambers by a crack of thunder so violent it seemed to shake the very foundations of Rothermere Hall, and she sat up in bed, with her heart racing, and transported instantly back to childhood, to the night when she was 7 years old, and lightning had struck the old oak near Ashford Manor, and the tree had exploded in flames, and she had watched from her window in terror as the fire consumed the ancient branches, certain the world itself was ending. And though she was now a grown woman of 23, and storms still carried that primal fear, that sense of nature's terrible power and her own smallness before it, and she tried to calm herself, breathing slowly, reasoning that she was safe within these solid walls, but the thunder came again and again, each crash seeming louder than the last, and the lightning illuminated her chambers in stark flashes that threw shadows leaping across the walls, and she found her hands were trembling, and her breath was coming too quickly, and she rose from bed and wrapped herself in her dressing gown, pacing to the window where she could see the storm raging across the estate, trees bending before the wind, rain lashing the glass in sheets, and she was standing there, trying to master her fear, when she heard a soft knock at her door, so quiet she almost mistook it for the storm, and she called out, "Yes?" and the door opened to reveal Sebastian, also in his dressing gown, a candle in his hand, and he said gently, "Forgive the intrusion, Eleanor. I remembered that you flinched when thunder sounded in the distance several days ago, and I thought I wondered if the storm might be disturbing you." And Eleanor felt something break open in her chest at this admission, at the realization that he had noticed such a small detail and remembered it, and had come to check on her welfare, despite the impropriety of appearing at her chambers in the night. And she said honestly, her voice not quite steady, "I have feared storms since I was a child. It is foolish, I know, but I cannot seem to master it." And Sebastian shook his head and said, "It is not foolish to fear what once frightened us. Would you permit me to stay until the storm passes? Only for company, nothing more, but I thought you might prefer not to be alone." And Eleanor, grateful beyond words, accepted his offer, and they sat together in her sitting room, the connecting door to her bedchamber left properly open, and they talked as the storm raged outside, their conversation ranging across subjects both deep and light, childhood memories and present dreams, disappointments they had weathered and hopes they still harbored. And Sebastian told her about the winter his mother had died, how the snow had fallen for days afterward, as though the sky itself was mourning, and Eleanor spoke of her fear after Philip's abandonment, that she would never be valued, never be chosen, never be enough. And Sebastian said quietly, fiercely, "You are more than enough, Eleanor. You are remarkable." And the words settled into her heart, like warmth spreading through cold rooms, and the storm outside seemed to mirror the turbulence of feelings growing between them, wild and powerful and impossible to contain. And when dawn finally broke, soft and grey through the dissipating clouds, they both realized they had talked through the entire night, and the storm had passed without Eleanor noticing its end. And when Sebastian rose to leave, their eyes met and held, and Eleanor knew that something fundamental had shifted between them, some final barrier had dissolved, and she was no longer simply living in his house but dwelling in his heart, as he had begun to dwell in hers. The following week brought Eleanor's first official visit to the village as Duchess of Rothermere, and she descended the great stone steps of the hall with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, for she had seen the village only from the carriage window during her arrival, and now Sebastian had invited her to accompany him on his regular calls to the tenants, and as their carriage rolled down the tree-lined drive and through the gates onto the road that led to the cluster of cottages and shops that comprised the village, Eleanor felt the weight of her new position settling upon her shoulders, understanding that these people would be looking to her not merely as Sebastian's wife but as their duchess, a figure of authority and benevolence whose character would be scrutinized and judged, and she straightened her spine and lifted her chin, determined to meet their expectations with grace. The village was larger than she had imagined, a proper community with a church and an inn, and various shops arranged around a common green, and as their carriage came to a stop, Eleanor noticed faces appearing in windows and doorways, curiosity evident in every expression, and Sebastian helped her down with a steadying hand, murmuring, "They will love you as they should," and Eleanor caught the slip in his words, the thing he had almost said, and her heart quickened even as she focused on the present moment. And they walked together toward the first cottage, where Sebastian explained a tenant farmer needed to discuss drainage issues, and Eleanor listened as Sebastian spoke with the man with respect and genuine interest, and she found herself asking questions about the man's family, his children, his hopes for the next planting season, and she saw the surprise in the farmer's weathered face that the Duchess would care about such things, would speak to him as though his answers mattered. And when they left, Sebastian said quietly, "You have a gift for making people feel seen, Eleanor," and she realized she genuinely cared, that these were not abstract concepts of tenants and duties, but real people whose lives intersected with hers, and she wanted to know them, to help where she could, to be worthy of the position she had so unexpectedly assumed. It was at the third cottage that they encountered the sick child, a girl of perhaps 6 years old, and the mother's worried face told Eleanor everything before words were spoken, and while Sebastian discussed practicalities with the father, a doctor would be sent from the estate, medicine would be provided. Eleanor asked if she might sit with the child for a moment, and the mother, surprised but grateful, led her to the small bedroom where the girl lay pale and feverish in her bed, and Eleanor sat beside her and took her small hot hand and spoke to her gently, telling her stories of brave princesses and kind dragons, and the child's eyes, though heavy with illness, focused on Eleanor's face with trust, and Eleanor felt something shift in her heart, an understanding of what it meant to be part of this community, to have the power to bring comfort and the responsibility to use it well. And when she finally emerged from the cottage, she found Sebastian waiting, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before, something soft and wondering and profoundly moved. And he said nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes, and the village women who had gathered at a respectful distance to observe their duchess seemed to reach some collective conclusion, and Eleanor felt their acceptance settle around her like a warm shawl. And on the return journey to Rothermere, as the carriage swayed gently along the rutted road, Sebastian said, "You were remarkable today, Eleanor. The way you spoke with them, the genuine care you showed, you have brought something to Rothermere that has been missing for far too long." And Eleanor, emboldened by the emotion in his voice, said quietly, "You have brought life back to Rothermere, but perhaps we have brought life back to each other." And the words hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of what they had both been feeling but neither had dared to name, and Sebastian reached across the space that separated them on the carriage seat and took her hand, and this time neither of them pulled away, and their fingers intertwined as though they had been designed to fit together exactly so, and Eleanor felt the warmth of his touch spreading through her, like sunlight through morning mist, burning away the last vestiges of the confusion and uncertainty that had characterized the early weeks of their marriage, and she understood with sudden clarity that what had begun as a desperate rescue, a stranger's incomprehensible kindness, had transformed into something real and deep and necessary, and that she was no longer simply living in Sebastian's house or bearing his name, but dwelling in his heart as he had come to dwell in hers. And the realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, for she had not thought to find love again, and had not imagined herself capable of trusting another man after Philip's betrayal. But here was Sebastian, patient and kind and true, and here was her own heart, opening despite her caution, reaching toward him like those neglected garden plants reaching toward light, and neither of them spoke for the remainder of the journey, but their hands remained clasped, and that silent communication said everything that words could not yet express. The letter arrived on a grey December morning, when frost still clung to the windows of Rothermere Hall, and Eleanor was in the breakfast room with Sebastian, discussing plans for the estate's Christmas preparations, when Mrs. Brennan entered with the post arranged on a silver tray, and Eleanor noticed immediately the letter addressed to her in handwriting she had once known as well as her own, and her hand froze halfway to her teacup, and Sebastian, ever observant, followed her gaze and saw what she had seen, and he said quietly, "That is Philip's hand, is it not?" And Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, and a cold dread settled in her stomach, for she had not heard from Philip since that terrible morning in September, had not wanted to hear from him, had tried her best to forget he had ever existed, and now here was his writing, stark and familiar on the cream-colored envelope, intruding into the life she had been building with such careful hope, and Sebastian said, "You need not read it if you do not wish to. I can have it burned." But Eleanor shook her head and said, her voice steadier than she felt, "No, I should know what he has to say." And she took the letter with trembling fingers, acutely aware that Sebastian remained in the room, a solid presence beside her, and she broke the seal and unfolded the pages, and Philip's words swam before her eyes, an apology of sorts, though inadequate and self-pitying, explanations that revealed more cowardice than honor, confessions of gambling debts that had grown insurmountable, admissions of panic and shame that had driven him to flee rather than face the consequences of his choices, and then news that he was emigrating to America, sailing within the week, attempting to start fresh where his failures were unknown, and woven throughout the letter was an assumption that cut deeper than any apology could heal, the presumption that she must hate him, that she must be miserable in her hasty marriage to a stranger, that her life must be a prison of regret and suffering. And as Eleanor read these words, she waited for the anger to come, the bitterness, the sense of betrayal renewed. But what she felt instead was something she had not anticipated, a profound and complete indifference, an absence of feeling so total it startled her, and for this man who had once been her intended, whose abandonment had shattered her world only 3 months prior, now seemed to her a character from someone else's story, distant and inconsequential, and she realized with a clarity that stole her breath that she did not miss him, had not missed him for weeks now, perhaps had never truly loved him at all. For what she had felt for Philip was nothing, a pale, thin shadow compared to what was growing in her heart for Sebastian, this man who sat beside her now, patient and concerned, whose presence had become as necessary to her as breathing. And she set down the letter with steady hands and looked at Sebastian and saw in his eyes both worry and something deeper, a fear of what Philip's words might have awakened in her. And she read aloud the relevant portions, the apology, the explanations, the news of his departure, her voice calm and measured. And when she finished, Sebastian was quiet for a long moment before asking, his voice carefully neutral, "Do you regret it, Eleanor? Our marriage? If you could undo what happened that day, if Philip had not fled, would you wish it otherwise?" And Eleanor felt the weight of the question, understood that her answer would determine everything that came after, and she said with absolute honesty, meeting his eyes so he could see the truth of her words, "Not anymore, not for some time now. If I am being truthful, Sebastian, I think perhaps that morning was not the disaster I believed it to be, but rather a deliverance. For if Philip had not abandoned me, I would have married him, and I would never have known." And she stopped, uncertain how to articulate what she had only just begun to acknowledge to herself. But Sebastian leaned forward, his hand covering hers on the table, and he said, "Never have known what?" And Eleanor took a breath and said, "Never have known what it felt like to be truly seen, to be chosen not for convenience or connections but for myself, to find a partnership built on respect and understanding, to feel," and again she hesitated, and Sebastian finished gently, "to feel that you are exactly where you belong." And Eleanor nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, and she said, "Yes, exactly that." And Sebastian's grip on her hand tightened, and he said, his voice rough with emotion, "Then we are in agreement, for I feel precisely the same, and I cannot regret the circumstances that brought you to me, however painful they were, for they led to this moment, and to every moment we have shared since, and to whatever moments lie ahead." And Eleanor understood that they were acknowledging what had been building between them for weeks, giving voice to the transformation their strange marriage had undergone. And she looked down at Philip's letter, at his assumptions of her misery, and she felt a stirring of something that might have been pity, for he had no idea what he had relinquished, no comprehension of the gift his cowardice had inadvertently given her. And she folded the pages carefully and said, "I wish him well in America. I hope he finds whatever peace he seeks. But he is part of my past now, Sebastian, not my present, and certainly not my future." And the words settled between them like a vow, and Sebastian raised her hand to his lips and kissed her fingers with a tenderness that made her heart ache. And outside the frost was melting from the windows, as weak sunlight broke through the grey clouds, and Eleanor thought that this too was symbolic, this slow warming, this gradual thaw, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life had begun, not on that terrible morning in September when Philip had abandoned her, but in the moment when Sebastian had walked through the church doors and offered her a choice, and she had been brave enough, or desperate enough, or perhaps simply wise enough, to take it. December arrived at Rothermere Hall with the first snow of the season, fat white flakes drifting down from a pewter sky to blanket the estate in hushed stillness, and Eleanor stood at the great window of the drawing-room watching the transformation of the landscape, thinking how different this winter would be from what she had imagined months ago, when she had still believed herself destined to be Lady Hastings. For now she was a duchess, and more surprisingly, she was discovering herself to be happy, genuinely and unexpectedly happy. And when Sebastian entered the room behind her and asked what occupied her thoughts, she turned to him with a smile and said, "I was thinking we should celebrate Christmas properly this year. Bring light and warmth to Rothermere, for it seems a house that has been too long without celebration." And the expression that crossed Sebastian's face was one of such profound gratitude that Eleanor felt her heart contract with tenderness. And he said, "I cannot remember the last Christmas that felt like anything but an endurance to be survived." And Eleanor crossed to him and took his hands and said, "Then, let us create new memories, better ones." And so they began, and the following days saw Rothermere transformed as Eleanor organized the staff and planned decorations and arranged for greenery to be brought in from the woods, and Sebastian watched her moving through the house with purpose and joy, bringing life to rooms that had been dormant for years, and he thought that she was like spring arriving in the depths of winter, unexpected and precious and utterly necessary. And on the evening of the 23rd, They found themselves alone in the library, and the servants had been decorating earlier, stringing garlands and hanging ornaments, and Eleanor was attempting to place a particularly beautiful glass sphere on a high branch of the small tree that had been brought in, and she stretched up on her toes, and Sebastian moved to help her, and their hands met on the ornament, and it slipped from both their grasps and fell. But Sebastian's other hand shot out and caught it before it could shatter, and they both laughed, breathless with relief, and Eleanor said, "Your reflexes are remarkable." And Sebastian said, "Years of catching things my father threw at me in temper," and then immediately looked surprised that he had revealed such a thing, for they did not often speak of his father, and Eleanor's expression softened with understanding, and she said gently, "Then I am glad you learned the skill, even if the lessons were unkind." And Sebastian set down the ornament carefully and turned to her, and there was something in his eyes that made Eleanor's breath catch, and he said, "Eleanor, But whatever he meant to say was interrupted by Agnes entering with more ribbons, and the moment passed. But later, after the maid had gone, and they were hanging the final decorations together, Eleanor looked up and realized they were standing beneath a sprig of mistletoe that the servants must have hung earlier, and she said, "Sebastian," and he followed her gaze upward and went very still, and for a long moment neither of them moved, and then Sebastian said quietly, "I would not presume, but Eleanor," emboldened by weeks of growing certainty, by the knowledge that her feelings were returned, even if unspoken, stepped closer to him and said, "Then let me," and she rose on her toes and kissed him, tentatively at first, a brush of lips that was almost a question, and Sebastian made a sound low in his throat, and his arms came around her and he deepened the kiss, and years of loneliness melted between them like snow, meeting warm earth, and when they finally drew apart, both breathing unsteadily, Sebastian touched his forehead to hers and whispered, "May I court my own wife, Eleanor? May we begin again properly this time with intention and hope?" And Eleanor laughed, the sound breaking on something that might have been a sob, and she said, "I thought you would never ask." And Sebastian said, "I have been falling in love with you since the moment you sat beside that sick child in the village. Perhaps before, perhaps since the moment I saw you standing alone at that altar, so brave and so broken," and Eleanor said, tears spilling down her cheeks now, "and I have been falling in love with you slowly, in 1,000 small moments, in every kindness and every conversation, and I did not know it was possible to feel this way, to be so certain of another person." And they stood there in the library, surrounded by Christmas greenery and candlelight, holding each other as though they had finally found harbor after a long and terrible storm, and they both understood that this was the true beginning of their marriage, that everything before had been prologue, and that now, finally, they were ready to build the life they had been circling toward since that impossible day in September. Christmas morning arrived at Rothermere Hall with a crystalline beauty that seemed almost enchanted. The entire estate blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled under a sky of piercing blue, and Eleanor woke in her chambers with a sense of anticipation she had not felt since childhood, for her family was arriving today, her parents and her younger sister Henrietta, and this would be their first meeting with Sebastian as her true husband, rather than the mysterious stranger who had rescued her from ruin, and she was nervous. Eleanor realized as Agnes helped her dress in a gown of deep forest green that Sebastian had commissioned for her. Nervous because she wanted them to see what she had found here. He wanted them to understand that the hasty marriage that had seemed like trading one disaster for another had become something precious beyond measure. And when the Hartley carriage arrived mid-morning, Eleanor was standing in the great entrance hall with Sebastian beside her, his hand warm at the small of her back, and her mother emerged first, taking in the grandeur of Rothermere with wide eyes before turning her attention to Eleanor. And Eleanor saw the questions in her mother's expression, the maternal concern that had filled her letters these past months, and after the formal greetings had been observed and her father had shaken Sebastian's hand with a respect that seemed genuine, her mother drew Eleanor aside under pretense of showing her to the guest chambers, and once they were alone, Mrs. Hartley took her daughter's hands and said, "Tell me truly, Eleanor, are you happy here? Are you well? I have worried so much, imagining you trapped in a marriage of convenience to a man you barely knew." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow, and she said, "Mama, I am happier than I ever imagined possible. I know it must seem strange, given how everything began, but Sebastian he is everything I did not know I needed." And her mother studied her face carefully, seeing something there that made her own expression soften. And she said, "You love him, not a question but a statement." And Eleanor nodded and said, "More than I thought myself capable of loving anyone." And Mrs. Hartley embraced her daughter tightly and whispered, "Then I am glad, so very glad, for I could not bear to think of you suffering." And that evening, as they all gathered for Christmas Eve dinner, Eleanor watched Sebastian charm her family with his quiet intelligence and genuine warmth, saw how he listened attentively to Henrietta's chatter about her season in London, how he drew her father into conversation about estate management, how he ensured her mother was comfortable and well attended, and she felt a fierce pride in him, this man who was hers. And later, when the family had retired to the drawing room, Sebastian said he had gifts to distribute, and he gave to Eleanor's parents a generous purse to settle debts he knew they carried, though he framed it as gratitude for entrusting their daughter to his care. And to Henrietta he gave a string of pearls that had belonged to his mother, and then he turned to Eleanor and said, "Your gift cannot be brought inside, I fear. You must come with me." And he led her, wrapped in her cloak, out into the cold night where snow crunched beneath their feet. And he took her to the gardens, and there in the moonlight Eleanor saw that the neglected beds had been cleared and prepared, stakes driven into the ground to mark new plantings, and Sebastian handed her a roll of papers, and when she unrolled them, she saw they were detailed plans for restoring the gardens, drawn in Sebastian's own hand, and he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I want to build a future here, Eleanor, with you. I want to bring beauty back to this place, to fill it with life and laughter, and I need you to know that you are the center of that future, at the heart of everything I hope to create." And Eleanor could not speak past the tightness in her throat, and instead she reached into her own cloak and withdrew a wrapped package, and Sebastian opened it to find a portrait, his mother's face young and lovely and carefully restored, for Eleanor had found the painting damaged in the attic weeks ago and had secretly sent it to London to be repaired. And when Sebastian saw it, his breath caught, and tears spilled down his cheeks unchecked, and he said, "You have given me back something I thought lost forever." And Eleanor said, "As you have done for me." And that night, when they returned to the hall and climbed the stairs together, they did not part at Eleanor's door, as had become their custom, and instead Sebastian followed her inside, and what passed between them in the privacy of her chambers was tender and passionate and utterly transformative, the final barrier between them dissolving, and afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Eleanor thought that they had finally found what neither had been seeking but both desperately needed, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life had truly begun, not on that terrible September morning, but on this perfect Christmas Eve, in the arms of the man who had become her home. January arrived at Rothermere Hall with a silence so profound it seemed the world had been wrapped in wool, snow piled high against the manor's ancient stones, and ice crystallizing on the window-panes in patterns that caught the weak winter light. And within those walls, Eleanor and Sebastian discovered the full depths of what they had begun on Christmas Eve, for the consummation of their marriage had opened floodgates neither had anticipated, and now they moved through their days in a state of profound intimacy that was as much emotional as physical. And Eleanor found herself sharing thoughts she had never spoken aloud, dreams and fears and hopes that had lived only in the private chambers of her heart, and Sebastian in turn revealed himself in ways she suspected he never had with another soul, telling her of his childhood loneliness after his mother's death, of his father's cold disappointment, of the broken engagement that had left him convinced he was unworthy of genuine affection, and Eleanor would hold him when these confessions came and whisper that he was worthy, so deeply worthy, and they would lie together in her chambers, for Sebastian no longer returned to his own rooms at night and talk until dawn grayed the windows. And as February arrived with its bitter winds, they turned their attention to planning for Rothermere's future, sitting together in Sebastian's study with ledgers spread before them, and Eleanor's quick mind grasping the intricacies of estate management with an aptitude that both surprised and delighted her husband. And it was Eleanor who proposed the school, saying one evening as they reviewed the accounts that the tenant children deserved education, that investing in their futures would strengthen the entire community, and Sebastian had looked at her with such pride and said, You have a vision for this place that I never possessed, and I trust your instincts completely." And so they began planning in earnest, though the estate finances were stretched thin after years of Sebastian's father's poor management, and they spent long hours working through possible solutions, and it was ultimately decided that several unused properties in London should be sold, holdings that generated little income but required maintenance, and through all of this, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose blooming within her that she had never experienced in her previous life. For she was not merely a decorative wife but a true partner, and her opinions valued, and her contributions essential, and the village had fully embraced her now. The women greeting her warmly when she visited, and bringing their concerns to her attention. And one afternoon Mrs. Brennan entered the drawing room where Eleanor sat with correspondence and said, unprompted, "Haven't seen His Grace smile in 10 years, Your Grace, not until you arrived, and now it seems he cannot stop." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the simple observation, and that evening when Sebastian returned from riding the estate boundaries, snow clinging to his greatcoat and colour high in his cheeks, Eleanor went to him and helped him remove the heavy garment and said, "I have found something here I did not know existed." And Sebastian cupped her face in his still cold hands and asked, "What is that?" And Eleanor said, "A home, not just a house or a position, but a true home, and a purpose beyond mere existence, and a love that makes me want to become better than I am." And Sebastian kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and said against her lips, "You have given me the same, and I thank God for every circumstance that brought you to that altar, even the painful ones, for they led us both exactly where we belonged." March arrived at Rothermere Hall with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the transformation within its walls, the harsh grip of winter loosening day by day as the land began its annual resurrection, and Eleanor stood at her chamber window one morning, watching the first brave crocuses push through the softening earth, and felt a corresponding stirring within her own body, a subtle change that she had suspected for several weeks, but had not spoken aloud, and when she placed her hand against her still flat stomach, she knew with absolute certainty that she was carrying Sebastian's child, and the knowledge filled her with a joy so profound it nearly overwhelmed her, though beneath that joy ran an undercurrent of fear, for her own mother had lost 2 babes between Eleanor and Henrietta, and childbirth was a passage through which not all women emerged. But when she told Sebastian that evening in the library where they sat reading together, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for, his face transforming with wonder as he knelt before her chair and placed his large hands carefully on her stomach as though he might feel the tiny life already. And he said, "A child. Our child," his voice thick with emotion, and then Eleanor saw the fear surface in his eyes, the same fear she carried, and he said, "I cannot lose you, Eleanor. I have lost everyone I have ever truly loved, and if something should happen." But she stopped his words by taking his face in her hands and saying, "We will face whatever comes together, as we have faced everything else. And you must have faith, my love, for we have too much to live for now." And in the days that followed, Sebastian became almost unbearably tender with her, his hand finding her stomach at every opportunity, his protectiveness intensifying until Eleanor had to gently remind him that she was not made of glass. And meanwhile the estate gardens began their own miracle, the bulbs that Sebastian's mother had planted decades ago emerging from the earth in defiant profusion, crocuses giving way to daffodils and tulips, and Eleanor and Sebastian would walk among them in the lengthening evenings and speak of the future, of the child who would grow up here knowing love and security, and they began planning the nursery, choosing rooms that had stood empty and unused for generations, and Eleanor wrote to her mother with descriptions of her happiness that made her own hand tremble with the force of feeling. And one afternoon in the village, where Eleanor had gone to discuss plans for the school's construction, she encountered quite unexpectedly Lady Hastings, Philip's mother, and the older woman stopped as though struck, and after a long moment she approached Eleanor and said, her voice trembling, "Your Grace, I must offer my deepest apologies for my son's unconscionable behavior, and for the pain and humiliation he caused you." And Eleanor, who had once imagined this woman as a future mother-in-law, felt nothing but a distant pity, and she said with perfect sincerity, "Lady Hastings, your son's choice, though painful at the time, led me to exactly where I belonged, and I have found a happiness I never would have known otherwise. so I bear him no ill will, and I hope he has found some measure of peace in his new life." And the older woman's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed Eleanor's hand and said, "You are gracious beyond what we deserved, and the Duke is fortunate beyond measure." And as Eleanor walked back to Rothermere Hall that afternoon, her hand resting on the place where their child grew, she thought that fortune had indeed smiled upon them both, transforming what had begun in desperation and scandal into something luminous and true. Late spring arrived at Rothermere Hall with all the abundance that the season promised. The gardens now fully alive, with Sebastian's mother's bulbs blooming in glorious profusion, and Eleanor moved through those gardens with increasing difficulty as her pregnancy advanced, her body growing heavy with the child she carried. And it was in early May that Dr. Whitmore, summoned for a routine examination, emerged from Eleanor's chambers with an expression that made Sebastian's blood run cold, and the physician spoke carefully of concerns about Eleanor's health, about complications he had observed, about the narrowness of her frame and the size of the child, and Sebastian heard the unspoken warning beneath the careful words, "Childbirth might claim her," as it had claimed so many women. And in that moment, every loss he had ever endured came rushing back with suffocating force. His mother's death when he was 12, his father's cold withdrawal afterward, the fiancée who had abandoned him, and the thought of losing Eleanor, who had become the very center of his existence, filled him with a terror so profound he could barely breathe. And when he entered her chambers, she took one look at his face and understood, and she reached for his hand and said, "Come, sit with me." And when he sat beside her on the chaise, she said gently, "You are afraid," and he could not deny it, saying with raw honesty, "I cannot lose you, Eleanor. I have lost everyone I have ever truly loved, and if something should happen during the birth—" But she placed her fingers against his lips and said, "Then have faith, my love, for we have too much to live for, you and I and this child, and I do not intend to leave you, not now, not when we have built something so precious together." And her calm certainty steadied him somewhat, though the fear remained a constant companion through the following weeks, and the estate seemed to hold its breath along with them. The servants praying for the Duchess's safety, Mrs. Brennan organizing the household with military precision, and Sebastian became almost unbearably attentive, rarely leaving Eleanor's side, his hand finding her swollen belly at every opportunity, as though he could protect both wife and child through sheer force of will. And when Eleanor's labor began on a warm June evening, the pains coming fast and hard, Sebastian refused to leave despite propriety dictating that husbands remain elsewhere, and he stayed through that long agonizing night, holding Eleanor's hand as she struggled and suffered, whispering encouragements and prayers and promises, and dawn was breaking over Rothermere, the gardens golden in the early light, when the child finally came with a lusty cry, a son, healthy and strong, and Eleanor lay exhausted but alive, gloriously alive, and Sebastian wept as he held her, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude streaming down his face unchecked. And when the midwife placed the baby in Eleanor's arms, she looked at Sebastian with such love and said, "See, I told you to have faith." And in that moment their small family was complete, and they named him James Thomas, after both their fathers, a bridge between past and future. And in the days that followed, as Eleanor recovered with Sebastian hovering devotedly nearby, both of them knew they had passed through darkness into light, and the love between them had been tested and proven unbreakable.